So, on to the second session that I'm beginning to continue as a understanding of scripture in a postmodern world and what we want to kind of grow out of a tradition that's rooted on something that hasn't really been changing at all or kind of engaging with any kind of contemporary worldview. I'm part of a philosophy club, and I had asked the question of what is postmodernism? And there's one person on Facebook who replied. His name's I'm not butchering his name. I think it's Rugo Rudy. And he said it's a philosophical and cultural movement that challenges traditional notions of truth. And I really like this because it's basically explaining what we're all struggling with. Well, what I was struggling with personally is that sometimes we have ideas in our mind of things that are we've almost accepted to be concrete and they're not going to change, and we can kind of build our identity on them. And we almost have that reassurance that we can change anything, but we can continue to build on it, and we won't feel like we're kind of shaken to the core in any kind of fundamental way. So, with um, a new perspective of kind of like a postmodern lens, that whole idea gets completely deconstructed and it's reevaluated in kind of like a global setting, first of all, because something that you kind of take for granted as true in, for example, my parents' history growing up, which was in Egypt, so let's say 60 years ago. um, they were born into a context where I cannot, like when they came to Canada and then present day, I can't relate to any of those three stages in my current state right now. So I can kind of say, I'm glad that you have the stories to share with me. Where, like, for example, you can have a career for your entire life basically, and it doesn't have to change, and that's just your stable life, and you don't really kind of question that that's the way it should be. Right now, it's very different. Um, and most people don't even want that. Like, not very many people still want that 9 to 5 job. So that's kind of the beginning of, I guess, what could be an introduction to why um, starting this kind of series on YouTube, I think, is important, not only for children, but for parents as well, so that they understand some of the questions that their children might be contemplating and maybe struggling with. That, just the simple kind of blanket answer of, well, this is the way it is and this is the way we were taught, really isn't going to suffice anymore. Um, so just to kind of create a little bit of a bridge moving forward, I wanted to try to understand how um, we feel about almost accepting tradition based on scripture without really understanding why that scripture is valid for us. So I think a lot of us are happy to kind of get into debates about God, and God exists, and then we explain nature, and how can nature not have a creator, and that's valid, that's good, but without having actually formally studied scripture and why um, the latest scripture that we have, for example, the Quran, is actually a form of reform to a status quo. So it's almost to say, because we are almost, well, we accept of ourselves that there won't be any more prophets after this, and there won't be any more scriptural revelation as such, like in a kind of um, organized fashion. Like we can't really expect to, from the Muslim perspective anyway, we can't really expect to have um, another prophet sort of come into the world. Um, it almost makes sense that this would be the last scripture. Like it's almost like that's it. Like you basically have everything you need. Anytime you're confronted with something that looks like it's based in tradition that's kind of antiquated, you're welcome to struggle and grapple with the contemporary knowledge and what the prevalent norm is, and see how to kind of progress through it. And it almost explains it in a way that um, allows for the society that was involved in this revelation to have such a multi, it's very like the personalities are very, very varied. So it's almost to say like no matter what walk of life you are from, you're going to find something that's going to be relevant to you. So there's so many rich traditions about different companions and how they kind of um, almost embodied whatever, I guess, new ideas were being presented. And also that it was a span of 23 years. So it's almost to say a majority of your life is going to be based on this lifelong study of how do I make sense of my contemporary context and how do I have to keep up with the fact that even though I'm understanding it, if I have children, they're probably going to be struggling against what I am trying to understand or keep up with me, or I'm gonna have to keep up with them. So it's almost like you never really get a break. And I kind of it's kind of a really exciting idea for, I mean, someone who has took the time off to understand why this kind of meaning making and searching for meaning can be its own self-gratification. Um, so I think just being open to that and vulnerable to the fact that we don't have to have all the answers and um, not knowing like 100% of what the Quran is actually suggesting is a good thing. It's always open to interpretation, and that is where much of the conflict is because people want to take it as a literal kind of just lift the verses and then kind of create a ruling and then that's it. But it's so much deeper than that, and it's part of the reason why I think it has 10 different recitations and a variety of hermeneutical authors, as it were. So I think just off the start, I wanted to kind of present this as a way of saying I don't want um, anyone who's listening from the audience to assume that they have to be from a certain traditional background. I am trying to keep it open-ended so that people don't feel like they're going to be the minority that's going to be sort of outcast or marginalized. I say Muslim and I kind of point to myself, but I do like the Rumi perspective or Gandhi's perspective of being a universalist, which is kind of to say I've studied a little bit of every tradition enough to say I don't want to just limit myself to one worldview because it almost suggests that I have to kind of have a favorite perspective, as it were. And even though I am more familiar with the Islamic perspective, I can't say that learning other perspectives hasn't enriched my own understanding of my own tradition. So just to start, knowing and admitting to the fact that we can't have um, an understanding that just because we're Muslim, we're just going to be somehow superior to having some kind of identification with what the Quran or the tradition of the Prophet at the time had, unless we've actually committed to studying it. And sometimes having an outsider's perspective is actually more useful because they don't necessarily have the hangups that we might be kind of assuming are kind of taboo because we've created this kind of hero worship and we're almost hesitant to see the Prophet as a human, not just someone who was inspired. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to try to keep the segments kind of short and hopefully sort of continuing off of the previous ones. Um, and yeah, I hope to hear from everybody and to keep it lighthearted so it's not really threatening because it is a really deep topic and I do find it important for like any kind of age and every kind of audience. So I'll see you soon.